Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham Yahushai, Bahasham Ruach HaKodesh. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. And today we're going to go into the book of Isaiah, the 16th chapter, and pretty much continuing right from the 15th chapter. We see that Isaiah here is pronouncing judgment, right? Or in this vision, he's seeing about calamities befalling Moab, right? As you know, both Jeremiah as well, Ezekiel, and some various other prophets prophesied not only to or against Israel, but also against these nations as well, right? Sometimes against Edom, or quite a lot of times against Edom, Moab, right? Sometimes even Ammon and some of the neighboring nations as well. So here we see this judgment, right, that would befall the Moabites. So this is Isaiah chapter 16, verse 1. It says here, "Send ye the lamb to the ruler of the land, from Selah to the wilderness, onto the mount of the daughter of Zion." And sending the lamb here is just, in other words, to say like, go and pay tribute. Because keeping in mind, the Moabites used to be under the under Israel, right? And they ended up breaking free, all right, from that reign. And when they were under us, they paid us tribute, but they ended up breaking loose, right, of that. I believe after the time of Ahab, during at least their king Mesha, his time, right? So here they're being told here, right, pretty much go and pay tribute, right, to the daughter of Zion. Verse 2, "For it shall be that as a wandering bird cast out of the nest, so the daughters of Moab shall be at the fords of Arnon." And I believe that there, like the fords of Arnon, was like one of the borders of the territory of Moab. And so here it's likening them scattering or trying to flee this destructive state, even up to the borders, right? Trying to find ways across it, which we also see a visual of that in the 15th chapter. "Take counsel, execute judgment, make thy shadows as the night in the midst of the noonday. Hide the outcast, bewray not him that wandereth." Okay, and so when you read, like in this case, as Isaiah is speaking against them here, you know, they're, once again, we know Isaiah spoke in a very, eloquent and oftentimes use metaphors, sometimes similes, speaking in this sort of poetic sense, right? So here he's almost like telling them like, hey, really the things you should have been doing, right, is to really execute proper judgment, because contrary to what you might think initially about the way of life of these heathens, they still suffer judgments at the hands of the Lord for wickedness, right? More so wickedness that they do against Israel, but also generally, right? And when you read about what the Lord told Jonah concerning the Assyrians, it's because they were doing a lot of wickedness, right? And when you read about when the Lord was going to bring us into the land of Canaan, he mentioned that, right? For when the measure of basically their iniquity in that land was fulfilled, it reached that point the Lord was waiting for. Then he ended up driving them out of the land. And also similarly for Babylon, right? The wickedness reaching up, right? Our sins have reached onto heaven. Sodom and Gomorrah, how their wickedness reached onto heaven. So it didn't matter that these were heathens. The wickedness is still wickedness. All right. And so the Lord also brings judgment upon even these nations for when they commit iniquity. All right. So as it says here, right, execute judgment, really proper judgment, and make thy shadow as the night in the midst of the noonday. Now, if we look at this in some of these other translations, right, oftentimes that, it helps a bit. But as it says here, let's see, NKJV, "Take counsel, execute judgment, make your shadow like the night in the middle of the day. Hide the outcast, do not betray him who escapes." right? It says in the ESV, give counsel, grant justice, make your shade like night at the height of noon, shelter the outcast. So when you in the nighttime, if it's very dark, you won't see your shadow, right? Because your body is not necessarily casting a shadow anymore since there's no light, right? If you're not in an area of light, like the sun that's coming upon you, all right, that sun hitting you is casting a shadow on the ground, right? The place where your body is sort of blocking. Um, and in the nighttime is not really so, right? Except you are walking by some place with light and then you see your shadow. But when it's completely dark, you don't really see your shadow, right? And so here, when you look at that verse, right, making your shadow as the night in the midst of the noonday, right, which is to signify like being a covering or hiding. And then it goes into the outcast, right? Hide the outcast, bewray not him that wandereth, and bewray meaning like to betray or to turn in, right, or expose him that wandereth, or one that may come into your land for, fleeing. And then it goes into verse 4, which um, directs that a bit more towards Israelites, right? And so what I mean is when you read verse 4, it says, let mine outcast dwell with thee, Moab, right? So who is the speaker here? Isaiah, but he's speaking the words of the Lord. Okay, so in this sense, the outcasts here that would be it's speaking about is Israelites, right? To say, let mine outcast dwell with thee, Moab, be thou a covert to them from the face of the spoiler. For the extortioner is at an end, the spoiler ceaseth, the oppressors are consumed out of the land. Now, when you read this, yes, it has, back then when you look at during various times in the history of Israel, there were times when heathen nations, right, the Lord sent heathens against us, or things got really bad in the land, and you had Israelites that fled into the land of Moab, right, at various points, you know. But you also have, as we read from verse 4 into verse 5, this sort of prophetic tone in there, okay, as it starts to mention the spoiler and the oppressor, and you start to see that verbiage of like being consumed out of the land. Okay, so reading verse 4 again, right? Like I said, historically, you did have points in time where Israelites were able to flee into the land of Moab for refuge, right, at different points in time. But also in this time, right, looking at it in a more prophetic sense, the outcasts here would be likened onto as they refer to the diaspora or the scattered Israelites, right? So the scriptures say that we would have Israelites scattered amongst all various nations. Okay, and that includes also Moab as well. So as it says, be thou a covert to them from the face of the spoiler. So, for example, today you have Israelites that go back, right, historically, that fled amongst the Moabites, ended up dwelling amongst them, and then now they end up looking like them, right? So, unless by examining the spirit, you wouldn't be able to tell who is an Israelite or not, right? If they're just a straight Moabite. But as it says now, it goes into the face of the spoiler, right? Which we know ultimately is dealing with Esau Edom, right? He is the ultimate spoiler and the extortioner. But as we start to see here, which is why I mentioned that sort of prophetic part of it, because as it says here, for the extortioner is at an end, right? And when we look into the word spoiler, right, starting with that, Shaddad, it goes here, right? It says to deal violently with, right, to devastate, ruin, to spoil. And it says here, for the extortioner is at an end, right? Meaning their time is up. It's time for them to go down. The spoiler ceaseth. Extortioner, spoiler, still applying to the same subject here. The oppressors are consumed out of the land. Okay, and when is this ultimately going to happen, right? Along with other precepts that go into them being destroyed out of the land or being consumed out of the land, which goes into the downfall of Esau's kingdom ultimately, right? And so the oppressors here starts with Esau, Edom, but it really also applies to these heathens as well. And now when you go into verse 5, right? Continuing here, it says, and in mercy shall the throne be established, right? What throne is that? The throne of David. And he shall sit upon it in truth in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking judgment and hasting righteousness. And when is this going to happen? This is going to happen in the last days, right? After the downfall or the destruction of the oppressor, which is Esau, Edom. Now, when you read this in the NLT, right, I believe it sounds even clearer. Now, what I want to do is, can I actually pull up both of these? Or okay, it looks like it's just one at a time. So let me actually see if I can. Let's open this in a new tab. And where do we change the version? Here we go. So now let's move this to the NLT because I want to read both verses together. And what is this? This is Isaiah 16. There we go. So now in the NLT, if we go down to Isaiah 16 and 4 and 5, right, it says here, let our refugees stay among you, hide them from our enemies until the terror is past, when oppression and destruction have ended, and enemy raiders have disappeared. Then God will establish one of David's descendants as king. He will rule with mercy and truth. He will always do what is just and be eager to do what is right. So who is that ultimate one? Yahushua, right? But when you look at the context over here, this verse 4, right, continuing in verse 5 with that, then would have to be at some point very close prior to the establishment of that throne, right? Prior to the establishment of his kingdom, which would be Yahushua's kingdom. Okay, so that gives you that sort of lets you know that in these verses here, Isaiah starts to, jump, right? And there's that sort of prophetic part of it right there. And then he goes back in his vision here, speaking about the destruction of Moab, or the judgment that will come upon Moab. Okay. So going back to Isaiah 16 and verse 4, reading that again, right? Let mine outcasts dwell with thee, Moab, be thou a covert to them from the face of the spoiler, right? And when we also read in Isaiah the 14th chapter, right, it referred to Babylon, which is, tied with Esau, Edom as the oppressor, right? How is the oppressor ceased? I believe it was the golden city. Be thou a covert to them from the face of the spoiler, for the extortioner is at an end, right? That's when the Lord brings this destruction ultimately to put the reign of the oppressor to an end. It says, the spoiler ceaseth, the oppressors are consumed out of the land, and in mercy shall the throne of David be established, right? Which we are pretty much in that time now, where the Lord is going to establish that throne of David for all eternity. And he shall sit upon it in truth in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking judgment and hasting righteousness. Verse 6, we have heard of the pride of Moab, right? Once again, going back to focusing on Moab here. So we have heard of the pride of Moab. He is very proud, even of his haughtiness and his pride. Now, when you go back throughout history, right, up until now, you can see that, right? You can see that traits, that character traits about the Moabites, right? They have that proud, aspect to them, and especially when they're dealing with Jake, right? If they're a store owner or a business owner or whatever the case may be, right? Or even as a customer in a retail store, right? You can see they carry that sense of pride and arrogance to them. If you were to watch some of their dramas or TV shows and whatnot, you sort of see that pomp, and how they are and how they move. Which today I guess they would call them being very nationalistic, right, and so on. But anyway, as it says here, we have heard of the pride of Moab. He is very proud, even of his haughtiness and his pride and his wrath. But his lies shall not be so. And when you go into that word lies, it goes into empty or vain talk, right? Which is kind of like saying, like the puffed up speech, right, that they use to back up their pride is really vain, right? That's why it says it shall not be, or it shall not be so. So all the things that they boast themselves in, whether to do or are doing, the Lord is going to bring to naught. Verse 7, therefore shall Moab howl for Moab, right? In other words, the Moabites are going to be mourning and languishing. Why? Everyone shall howl for the foundations of Kir Hareseth shall ye mourn. Surely they are stricken, right? Which, when we look up this location here, I believe it was some territory of the Moabites. It says one of the two chief strongholds of Moab, right? And that is signifying the the calamity or the destruction that the Lord would be bringing upon them, as we read in the 15th chapter. Now, as we read on through here, Isaiah describes, right? Because remember, these visions the prophets received, they received some of them that are very specific, some of them that are somewhat specific, some of them that are context aware, and some of them that are more, general, but you get the point of what's going on, right? So with this judgment against Moab, when you actually look at the history of the Moabites, right, mainly in scripture, there were, and in some parts of secular history, there were different times where they suffered, judgments as well, mainly at the hands of these other nations, right, that would come up into power. And also, you can imagine them going through things that the Lord brings, right, plagues and so on and so forth. But it's not exactly clear in detail, right, when this sort of judgment at one point in history came upon the Moabites, right? Because this is a bit broad, right? It talks about their land, and them trying to flee out of their land. It talks about basically their as we're about to go into, their crops failing, the things that they would rejoice over being no more. And these are things that can apply to them in this time, right? Could have applied to them in different points in time during history. Okay. But we know here that all in all, the message here that the Lord has Isaiah giving is that these Moabites are not going to go unscathed, right? Not after the reproach that they have had towards Israel and the wickedness that they even do in their land. So different prophets had been prophesying about Moab and the destruction that would come upon them by the hands of the Lord. Okay, and at the time the Lord sees or saw fit, he brought or will bring this destruction, right, in various forms. So this is Isaiah chapter 16, continuing in verse 8. For the fields of Heshbon languish, and the vine of Sibmah, the lords of the heathen have broken down the principal plants thereof, right? So that gives you the sense of, for example, a defeat or a conquering, right, to some degree by another nation, okay, of the Moabites, right, whether it was completely taking over their land or just subjugating them under them. But as it says here, have broken down the principal plants thereof, they are come even unto Jazer. So in this verse, we get the sense that, there had to be some special vine or grapes over there in this region, which was really let's say popular, right, or well bought, as it mentions. And I'll pull this up in some of the other translations as they make it a bit clearer when they talk about how it has come to the different parts of that region. So let me finish reading it here in Isaiah. It says here, for the fields of Heshbon languish, and the vine of Sibmah, the lords of the heathen have broken down the principal plants thereof. They are come even unto Jazer. They wandered through the wilderness. Her branches are stretched out. They are gone over the sea. Right? So now if you look at this here in NLT, for example, it says, the farms of Heshbon are abandoned. The vineyards of Sibmah are deserted. The rulers of the nations have broken down Moab, that beautiful grapevine. Its tendrils spread north as far as the town of Jazer and trailed eastward into the wilderness. Its shoots reached as far west that they crossed over the Dead Sea. Now here in the NLT, they're more so likening Moab onto this grapevine or this vineyard that's been trodden down, right, by the rulers of the heathens or the other nations, which I guess is one fair perspective, right? But what I'm looking for more so is here we go, NIV. So it says here, the fields of Heshbon wither, the vines of Sibmah also. The rulers of the nations have trampled down the choicest vines, which once reached Jazer and spread toward the desert. Their shoots spread out and went as far as the sea, right? So that's sort of that visual of like this place which at one point harvested, these good vines and grapes and so on that were so good that they even, were spread up until regions of like Jazer and wilderness, which I guess here is more so around the region of the Dead Sea, right? That area, and even going across that area of that Dead Sea to that neighboring region over there, right? So the point here is like this place, which at one point was so fruitful in this manner, um, harvesting and having these great vines and vineyards and grapes and so on, have now been brought down to naught, right? In verse 9, it's going to go more into that. It says, therefore I will bewail with the weeping of Jazer, the vine of Sibmah. I will water thee with my tears, O Heshbon and Elealeh, for the shouting of thy summer fruits and for thy harvest is fallen. Now, Isaiah here, once again, as we know in the way that he writes, by him emphasizing how he would bewail and weep, it is to put more emphasis on how bad of a state Moab would be in, right? Like I gave the example in the previous lesson as to like judgment coming so bad upon them that it's like, damn, I would feel so bad even for you Moabites because of just how destructive or how worse of a condition you're going to find yourselves in. So it's kind of like along a similar sense here. But here, as he mentions, for your vineyard, your vine is failed. And it says here, the shouting of thy summer fruits and for thy harvest is fallen. Now, what it means by that is usually during the harvest time, right? Summertime or whatever other season they would harvest, typically like grapes and sometimes other crops this would apply to. The shouting was more of a rejoicing, right? When people would be treading, they would gather the grapes, right? And typically in the vineyard, they would have a wine vat, and they would dump the grapes in there, and then they would trample upon them. And that was usually done with singing, right, and joy and all of that kind of stuff, right? And then they would get the blood of the grapes, then they could use it to make the wine, and so it was a good time here. But here, as Isaiah is saying, with this destruction that's coming upon you, you're not going to be able to do that, right? That's why he mentions the shouting of your summer fruits and for your harvest is fallen, right? It's no more. It's rather replaced with mourning and fear and dread. Verse 10, and gladness is taken away and joy out of the plentiful field, right? So no more is sort of the image I just gave there of that rejoicing and trampling. And usually it would be more than one person trampling in the wine vat, right? Stepping on the grapes. Sometimes you have kids, your families and all of that. But here is he saying that's going to be taken away, right? And in the vineyards there shall be no singing, neither shall there be shouting. The treaders shall tread out no wine. And the treaders are those, when you tread, you're like stomping, right? So the treaders are those that would be stepping on the grapes. As it says here, the treaders shall tread no wine in their presses, though the wine press, the wine vat, same thing. I have made their vintage shouting to cease, right? And the vintage is like that gathering. So the Lord is saying here, in other words, right, with this destruction that I'm going to bring, it's going to bring a time of mourning, right? It's going to replace that time of joy with your crops, your harvest, that joyful season. Now all that is going to be gone and done away with. And typically that's what happens when, judgment comes, whether it's a famine or, it's war against another nation and you end up getting conquered or whatever the case is. Verse 11, Wherefore my bowels shall sound like an harp for Moab, right? Which is like somebody who is really, feeling sympathy or pain for you, right? And mourning for you. And mine inward parts for Kir-Haresh, right? And so Kir-Haresh being one of the regions of Moab, Moab generally speaking about Moab, these are both two ways of saying the same things, right? Like I'll feel bad or mourn for you. Not quite literally as though Isaiah really cared so much about Moab, but more so like, damn, this y'all really gonna be going through it. Verse 12, and it shall come to pass when it is seen that Moab is weary on the high place, that he shall come to his sanctuary to pray, but he shall not prevail. Right. So as these calamities come upon them, they're gonna go up even onto their high places, where typically those were like hills, groves, mountaintops, and they would pray to their gods or worship their idols. Right. So as it says, when they're weary upon their high places, right? Because imagine going through these calamities, how many times they would go constantly there to pray to their idols or their false gods, thinking that, it's those gods that are doing this to them. And by praying or sacrificing enough, they can gain favor, right? So as it says, when they're weary with that, and then they come into their sanctuary, their little temples, to then pray, none of that is going to prevail. That's not going to deliver them or get them out of the situation. Verse 13, this is the word that the Lord Yahweh hath spoken concerning Moab since that time. And in other words, right, what Isaiah is saying here is that the Lord has been pronouncing judgment like this against Moab since the past, right? NLT, right? The Lord has already said these things about Moab in the past, right? So this isn't new. The Lord has been pronouncing judgment against you guys from the beginning. And one example here is even going back to the book of Amos, right, which we know Amos preceded Isaiah, right? If we go down to our timelines right here, go down to the chronological map, and we scroll on over here, we have Isaiah over here and Amos right here, right? So even Amos prophesied against Isaiah. And this is why when Jeremiah came on the scene, around, see, where do we place Jeremiah? Here we go. Right. He came back maybe somewhat even close to 100 years after Isaiah. He mentions, right, the prophets that have been before me and before thee of old prophesied against great kingdoms and countries of evil, war, pestilence, and all of these things, right? Because quite literally they did. So going back to Isaiah 16 and verse 14, Isaiah is saying here, this is nothing new that I'm saying concerning you Moabites, right? It has been spoken of by other prophets as well. However, verse 14, but now the Lord Yahweh hath spoken, saying within 3 years, as the years of an hireling, which that was, 3 years wasn't like a erroneous number here per se, right? You could say like it was one of like the common numbers as well for like an hireling. You can hire somebody who would work or do a certain job for a certain time, and they would get paid for their time that they are, right? And typically with an hireling, if we agree on 3 years, or we agree on 1 year, or we agree on 6 months or 3 months, or 1 day, that's all I'm doing, right? And once I'm done, that's it. I'm not responsible for anything else. I get paid for what I worked, and I'm out of here, right? So as it says here, within 3 years, as the years of an hireling, and the glory of Moab shall be contemned with all that great multitude, and the remnant shall be very small and feeble, right? So at this point in time, which the Lord would bring that judgment, right? Isaiah mentions here 3 years. The Lord would bring Moab down, right, from that proud, haughty state they're in, to a point where all that's left of them, right, their remnants are going to be very small and pretty much weak, right? But a shadow or a fraction of what they used to be like. Now, this 3-year span here, I would look at it here as more like a particular point in time or duration that the Lord would set to start bringing Moab down, right? And reason being, if you look both scripturally and even historically, right, there isn't any direct account to say like immediately, right, in 3 years Moab just immediately got wiped out or they got like brought down heavily. Now, around this time, you did have, I believe, the Assyrians, which were a major superpower in that region. And as they conquered more and more, right, starting with the Northern Kingdom, they eventually made their way, down as well, right? However, like I said, when you even go to the time of Ezekiel and you go to the time of Jeremiah, they're still prophesying against Moab, right? The Moabites are still there and they're still prophesying against Moab. So we know that the Moabites weren't wiped out, right? Or say like destroyed per se immediately after the time of Isaiah, right? And this isn't anything strange because there are times when the Lord does that, right? He gives a certain time, and maybe it's a time when He's going to fulfill at another point in time, right? Or maybe it's a signal for when He's going to start to bring these things upon this particular nation, right? When we read about the prophecy against Nineveh, the Lord said, right, that He would destroy them, but then they repented and then He didn't, but then He ended up destroying them at a later time, right? Or when we look at the prophecy concerning Israel being in captivity under the Babylonians, it wasn't as long as it was said that it would be, right? That it was 70 years or so. But when you look at the duration of the Babylonian Empire, it wasn't 70 years, right? They didn't reign for 70 years. But it's sometimes the Lord gives exact time periods, sometimes He gives, just a time or a number to signify, a point in which He's going to do something. But nonetheless, the point here being that in verse 13 and 14, it has been spoken of that this judgment will come upon Moab. But now the Lord is going to bring a set point in time where it's no longer going to be, I prophesied about it, the next one prophesied about it, but rather now it's going to take hold upon them and, be fulfilled. So all in all, right, that brings us to the end of the book of Isaiah, the 16th chapter. Like I mentioned in the beginning, right, 16 and 15 are mainly like this prophecy about Moab, right, and their calamities that would come upon them. And we see in here in like verses 4 and 5, right, this sort of jump and mention in prophecy, about Israel, about the kingdom and so on, and then back to the judgment on Moab. So with that, Lord willing, this is edifying to the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Rechak Kodash. And until next time, Shalom.